Maybe I'd like to start by having each of you introduce yourselves, the company you're with, as well as kind of how you think about when you make AI investments, how do some of these filters come in or not? So, Christian?
Okay. Hi, I'm Chris. I work for a German utility company. So just to reflect to Anna, critical infrastructure is a domain which is actually also affected by all the regulations which we do see here. So today I have two perspectives. One, how do you deal as a large traditional corporation coming out of Germany in a very traditional industry and adapting to AI technology in the core business models? That's one part. And the other part is how do we invest actually in new technologies, new business models, new opportunities, and how do we deal with that? I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at EWE, so I'm taking care of basically all the new initiatives and the technology which we use, and we try to somehow to get it along with the Wild Wild West in good old Europe.
Hi everyone, I'm Gayathri. You can call me G if it's easier. I'm with Micron Ventures, the venture arm of Micron Technology. Late 2018, we announced a $100 million AI fund. We actively invest in startups that are applying AI in verticals like manufacturing, automotive, healthcare, agriculture, and also core technologies that enable the adoption of AI and machine learning. So this topic is very relevant for us. Quickly on the point of do we have an ethical AI lens? Not really, but it's become part of our thesis on an ongoing basis. When we look at companies as a big corporate, there's always a question when we invest in a company, we don't want to see our name in a publication in a bad light. So inherently, that kind of drives some of our thought process as we go through it. And there's a lot to be learned as well. As you invest, we discover new things. So I'll pass it on to Srini.
Hi, Srini Anant. I'm a partner at Intel Capital, and we are the corporate venture arm of Intel. We've been investing off the balance sheet for the last 30 plus years. So our AI investments are, they range all the way from silicon all the way up to applications. So we invest in various layers, infrastructure, observability, and applications. And as we look at, similar to G here, when we talk about the, where ethical AI fits in, so we've looked at applications all the way from IoT, biometrics, all the way up to like fintech and a few other areas. There are certain areas that are just tough, right? Facial recognition has been known to create, has been known to be biased. And so we stay away from certain areas, but there are others that we look at both there are positive and negative implications. And I'll talk later about, we have an investment in a company that does content moderation. And that's one of those things where it's very subjective. What is bullying or toxic in one area might not be in a different language. So these are all the lenses that we have to consider as we look at the applications. I think the easiest ones to do are the ones that are horizontal, but when it comes into the applications, whether it's healthcare, a few other areas where bias can creep in and can impact the outcomes, we are pretty wary, but that we don't shy away from investments, but we have to consider those implications.
Great, thank you.
Hi everyone, sorry I'm a little late. My name is Varun Jain. I'm a general partner at SE Ventures. We are a €500 million fund based here in Menlo Park. And all our capital comes from a single LP, which is Schneider Electric, but it's set up as a separate fund. I've been doing corporate venture for over a decade now. Before this, I was running the early stage fund at Qualcomm Ventures, which is one of the oldest and most successful corporate-backed funds out there. Coming specific to AI, again, investing in AI since I started in venture, frankly. And one of my first investments was a company called Cruise Automation, where we led Series A, and then eventually sold the business to GM for over $1 billion. So that was sort of the first major outcome in AI applications that happened back in 2016. And since then, we've seen an avalanche of ideas across all different kinds of sectors. Here at SE Ventures, we focus mostly on the application layer, and more specifically on AI applications that solve problems related to climate risk, energy management, manufacturing efficiency, and cybersecurity. So a lot of the data we deal with is machine data, so a little bit less prone to privacy issues and related concerns, but bias, drift, data drift, those are all very valid concerns here as well. And we'll talk about some of those.
Great, thank you, Varun. So maybe the next question is, you mentioned, Srini, a little bit that when you look at, there's certain areas that are kind of almost excluded from your investment focus, but there's others that you look at it, but you would dig in. Are there specific filters that you use when you dig into those areas that are kind of a little bit more gray than black and white?
Yeah, I would say so. So, for instance, let's take the example of AI in healthcare. And we have a portfolio company that is using machine learning models to replace animal testing. Now, there is no gray area to that, right? You can very clearly say, now the question is whether the FDA will approve it or not, how much more accurate can it be, because the alternative is something which is highly inaccurate. On the other hand, if you're making an entry, or if you're granting access to someone, or if you're granting, let's say, immigration, this thing based on a facial recognition of someone from a database of known terrorists or something like that, and you make a mistake, you're changing the outcome of that person and their access and their immigration and their livelihood. And so we do have those filters of what is it trying to replace, and is the alternative something that is far worse. And so today, I mean, the past few weeks, we have been seeing the conflict in Ukraine, and I came across this about how Ukrainian, the army has been using facial recognition to identify the dead soldiers and contacting the mothers. Now, we would not typically want to see something like that, facial recognition, used on soldiers, and because it could be used in bad ways, but there is some sort of upside here. So these are the gray areas. So I can think of an instance where we met a company that said they had the largest database of labeled images, and that was their key thing, and they said this will help with training the models, but we just couldn't get ourselves to make an investment because, for one, the authenticity and the source of that data, and how do you even validate it, and how do you make sure that there is a diverse enough data set that leads to good outcomes, right? And that seems to be the biggest issue with training and labeling data. And so we have tried to stay away from people who claim they have access to something proprietary or the largest data sets. We would rather invest in tools and picks and shovels, which can help set up the flow and leave the problem of gathering data to the customers.
Thank you. Christian, anything to add?
I would like to add, yeah, we invested actually in a company, just to give a use case, which called Beanic. It's also all around smart meter data, for example. So being a utility concerning about energy flows and so forth, there was the core motivation coming with disaggregation and accessing home energy management data. So one use case the company works on, and that's basically the question you ask for, is where do you put your filters on, and where do you have a borderline? And one use case is called elderly care. So detecting anomalies about senior people living at home. Are they still alive? Do they have, what are their patterns, basically? So coming from energy data and going far beyond energy,
sure.
And, dealing with information, creating value on one hand. So we do see potential on that using AI technology. But at the end, I think that what we heard today already is how do you address this kind of discussion, and how do you bring people together? What is the investment in a company like a startup to deal with all the regulations and so forth? I think what we have to keep in mind is, in this time, it's a discussion about values. Also in each startup, and it has to come from the top. It has to come from the CEO of a startup company. It has to come from the top of a large corporation to be aware what are the values in the ecosystem where you are in, and how do you execute on that with the tech guys, with the legal guys, with the business guys. And at the end, we're still in that phase where we find out how far we can go. But yeah, it's still gray. There's a lot of gray, 50 shades of gray, maybe.
Anything to add, Varun?
Not a lot.
Okay. So, Varun, let me ask you a question. I think we chatted a little bit about this. Can you give an example of where you discovered, a major unintended consequence happened with a portfolio company, and what was done after the fact, whether as an investor or a board to try and kind of remedy the situation?
Yeah, I'll save the names just for those sake. But we had a situation where we invested in an AI company early in the life cycle of the fund, where they had taken capital from a large company that had publicly published set of ethical guidelines around AI. And of course, when you're a large company and you publish something like that, you put a target on your back. And then there was some press reportage that, oh, this startup that you've invested in actually did some violation of your ethical principles. And you can imagine what that does to a small startup when somebody publishes an article like that because of an investor you have. And these are sort of the unintended consequences in this space. So it led to an audit, and that audit confirmed that there was no such violation. But despite that, being a public company, they decided to still sever their ties with that startup, which as a result of that led to loss of customers. It made it difficult for them to raise more capital. It created anxiety among their employees. But in this case, coming back to the role of the board, it was very clear that there was no violation. And it was, yes, bad press, but that's what it was. And this is where I think the mindset of a Silicon Valley VC really sparks in, right? Where they said, no, what is right is right. And the investors stood by the company. They bridged it repeatedly to make sure they are able to cross the chasm. They eventually did. Went on to raise hundreds of millions of dollars from top-tier investors subsequently, and are now one of the category leaders. So I think the lesson learned for us and generally for investors was that whenever you are dealing with something which may be deemed as quasi-gray, as I think my friend was saying here, you have to be very proactive and cautious, both as an investor and as a founder, that even if you do everything by the book, there may still be aspersions that you have to deal with. And what kind of processes can you set up from a data governance standpoint, from a commercial governance standpoint, so that you are always able to shine a light on those and keep yourself beyond scrutiny. In fact, we also encourage all such companies, whether they are in portfolio or not, to be more vocal about what they are doing to manage data well and to make sure that it's being used appropriately. So I think a lot of founders don't always understand these kind of issues that may surface, given how much curiosity and anxiety at the same time surrounds this topic of AI. Now, the incident I'm telling you is 3 years old. So a lot of water has flown under the bridge. I think people are becoming more comfortable with what AI can actually do and not do. So I'm assuming this anxiety eases with time. But still, I think there is an opportunity for startups that can help systematically solve this problem. At the same time, I think there is a onus on application providers to be very proactive about it.
Thank you, Varun. Anybody, would you like to add anything, Gayathri? Or
We didn't have a compliance issue that we had to deal with, but I'll just highlight the point about founder ethos and sort of principles. I think that was fundamental for us anytime we look at, right? So we invested in a company that does dash cams. There are many of those companies out there that look at data outside, that look at data, driver data, things like that. So talking to the founders they basically said, we will not do any analytics on driver data. It's just not in our DNA. We think it's a violation of privacy. If they turn on we will enable a camera, but it's the driver's responsibility to let them know, but we're not going to do any analytics on it, right? So every thought process, when you dig in during the diligence, it reveals that you and I share a portfolio company. It could be seen as, is it replacing? Is it enhancing? Or is it kind of the big brother watching over what the manufacturing, what's happening on the manufacturing floor, right? Again, what is the principle there? That was one of the questions we asked. How are the folks on the manufacturing floor treating the software? You may get buy-in from the management because it increases productivity, but what is the, what about the people who are being monitored?
Sure.
Right? So those are things that we look for to weed out some of this. And fundamentally, it comes down to the culture of the company. And typically in a startup, the culture is set by the founders, we feel.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, because if you go back, I think Anna pointed to the notion of values, right? And I think what we're finding is values are becoming more important at startups in early stage than it ever was, especially when you're deploying pervasive technology like AI. And so, and as part of our diligence, when we talk to founders, we actually look at, do they even care? And if they don't, then that to us is a red flag, because there's no way they'll catch it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Good. You want to add anything, Srini? Or?
No.
Any questions for folks here from the audience? Go ahead, Ravi. So the question is, let me try and repeat since I have a microphone, is what is the greatest need for AI ethics as part of the investment evaluation process? Okay. Anybody wants to take it?
This might not be very popular with capitalists, but you need regulations in certain areas. And it might not be applicable to everything, but we've seen that in the case of credit scores, things like FICO. I mean, you have to have a framework, you have to have some guardrails around where do you use AI, where are you allowed to use AI? Is it in the application, credit application? Is it in the filtering? Is it in the eventual granting of the loan? You go to medical data, if someone is being given, let's say, treatment based on a diagnosis, is that being checked by a human in the loop, right? You can use it to screen and you can use it to get to the next level, but what are those rules that govern the actual, provision of treatment there? So I don't think, all regulation is bad or all regulation is good, but clearly without knowing the guardrails, sometimes you invest in startups and you realize that what they're providing is probably in the gray area, and that is based on the regulatory environment at that moment. So this is a tough question to answer, that who in the government is really good enough to put these regulations in place, but I do think we are starting to see some of those, so that would help, right? Other than that, we do know how much capital is needed, what are the customers, right? All of that we can handicap. You just cannot handicap regulatory risk, especially unknown regulatory risk.
Thanks, Alan.
I would like to add the corporate perspective to that. On one hand, when we look from the venture capital standpoint, you hardly don't get any business model anymore where you don't have, like, we are AI-driven company or so forth. So now put yourself in a large corporation which is on the consumer side. So being in Europe and in Germany means that we also have to have the capability to decide what kind of software tools do we actually use for recruitment and so forth. And coming back to your question, actually, I wouldn't do it so much sophisticated. I think the greatest need is capability, and the greatest need is awareness. So talk about this topic and having skills and experts together, and educate also the board level, for example, in the company to make the right decision from that, to get people on board in the company who have the skill to bring people together and build the right fundamentals for our companies. That's something where I do have the greatest concern, that we don't have the mistake on the venture capital side. I mean, still some risk there, but on the corporate level, making large decisions for large companies, using technology, we still will be reflected to all the harms which comes from the regulation itself. So it's two sides of the medal here for us.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd like to add is, I think Olivia in her presentation will answer, she's just good research in this area on some tools that can be provided. But I think it comes back to the same issue, which is we are such early days and there's such low level of awareness that education has got to be a bigger part of it. And I think as investors, we have a role to play along with the entrepreneurs to make sure that technology is being used responsibility. I don't think there's any way out. If we wait for the answer to come from somewhere else, it'll be too late. Go ahead, Daniel.
Sorry. Actually, I'm pretty loud. I don't think I need a mic, so I think I completely agree with you, right? No startup is going to go from day one having a full suite, which is why I asked about the reporting question. You don't have your I's dotted and T's crossed from day one. You start with the MVP, and just even from a product build standpoint. So I tend to look at business model. What is your business model? If your business model is focused on engagement, I'm concerned, right? Because what are you driving towards? It comes back to the value question. How many of you here have your notifications on, when you install an app? Talk about losing autonomy, right? I was at a Berkeley program recently, and there was a neuroscientist who basically said, there was a report that came out apparently in 2017 that said that you turn off your phone, leave it in a different room, they take your cognitive IQ, and then they make you do the test. The phone's nowhere near you. Then the second iteration is the phone's turned off still, but it's in a purse or something where you don't see it. Your cognitive IQ, when you do the test, it drops. Phone's turned off. Third test, phone's still turned off. It's on a desk where you can see it. It's turned upside down. So turned off, upside down. You still don't see it. No notifications are obviously coming, but your cognitive IQ drops even more. So you've created a system where you're creating those kind of notifications have, subliminally forced you to look at your phone all the time. So just the mere presence of the phone is making you dumber, right? So that's what engagement does. So when you look at business models where it's all based on, virality and engagement, you have to question what steps will the company take to drive that kind of engagement. If they're ad-based, right, it's again engagement. There's a price for free. Nothing is free is a true statement. When you don't pay dollars, you're paying it with something else. So I think fundamentally you look for those things as an investor to kind of weed out some of those, at least in my perspective, to say, okay, what is the business model? What are the founder values? And then over time, can they build out that capability, right? Like an ethics. At least start with one person who, like a QA person who can check the box, right? But it needs to be part of the company's ethos, I think.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add to that, thank you, Gayathri, is I think for us, when we look at it, we actually ask the question, who owns product management in the startup? And it could be a founder or somebody else. And then we ask, is data privacy and AI governance even a word in the vocabulary? If it's not, we say, okay, you need to think about it. But you're right. We don't expect a startup to basically have all these things in place, but we see a journey. And I think Olivia will talk about it. And the journey is in seed and Series A, we look for the kind of founder ethos and the values you're talking about. But if the company's Series C and Series D and they got product management and there's nothing in there on AI governance, data privacy, we run for the hills because it's a big, big issue.
If you look to the VC world today, they are actually adopting like ESG policies currently in the actual state. So ethical AI has to come to the same level in terms how we deal with it. And coming back to your question, and being also a strategic investor, like being a corporate here, we use actually the fundamentals out of our startup portfolio to learn as a company faster than we could, being in a traditional organization. So we hope to match at the end also skills and insights to make corporate decisions better then.
And I'll do a quick plug for EAIGG, which is